So kia ora everyone, thank you very much for joining us this evening or morning, depending on where you're dialing in from. We're really pleased to have you with us for our session with Frank Convery. Ko Charlie Keeling aho. I'm a senior advisor in the communications and engagement team at the Commission, and I'll shortly explain how the session is going to run today. But before I do that, I'm just going to ask Bevan to lead us into the session with a karakia.
Ngā mihi nui kia koutou, I runga I te pāka whakata reo nei, tēnā koutou katoa. He mihi tino nui kia koe Frank, no Airani, tēnei te mihi nui kia koe, anei hi karakia. Poi poi a te Māori, poi poi a te Wairua, poi poi a te tapu, poi poi a te whenua o Papatū Ānuku. So that's, for those of us who speak English, that's nurture the life force, nurture the spirit, nurture the sacredness, nurture the lands of Mother Earth. Kia ora tātou.
Kia ora, Bevan, thank you. So before we kick off, it'd be really great if you could please write your name and the organisation or community you represent in the chat while I'm speaking, and let us know where you're joining us from in the world. It's always really good to see who we have participating in these sessions, especially since we can't see your faces. While you're doing that, I'll give you a bit more information on today's session. So this is the second Open Zoom in our international speaker series, and we're very privileged to have Frank Convery join us today, alongside our commissioners, Dr. Harry Clark and Catherine Leining, who will be hosting the session for us. Harry is an internationally recognised science leader in greenhouse gases research and is well regarded in the primary sector, both from a science and agribusiness perspective. And Catherine is one of our leading experts in Aotearoa on climate change mitigation policy with a specialisation in emissions trading. So during this session, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Harry and Catherine will field these and pose them to Frank during our Q&A slot, which will be later on in the session. We'll try to get to as many as we can throughout. But before we get to your questions, we're going to be hearing from Frank first, followed by a short discussion between Frank, Harry and Catherine. Then it'll be your turn to have your say as we work through the questions we receive. If you want to speak to each other or share your thoughts, feel free to use the chat. It's always really good to see your conversations, and it can be a great space to share your thoughts and any helpful resources. And I just wanted to let you know that we are recording this session, so anyone who was unable to make it is able to watch it on our website afterwards. I think that's enough from me for now, so I'm going to hand over to Harry, who will introduce Frank and explain a bit more about what we'll be discussing in the next hour. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. And it's a really warm welcome to everyone, and especially warm welcome to Frank. I think the last time we bumped into each other, it was on Lambton Quay in Wellington, and it's a bit of a pity that we still can't see you a bit more frequently in New Zealand, but at least we do have the technology to see each other and catch up occasionally as well. Just a bit of background for Frank. Frank is a forester by background and a forest economist. Studied at University College Dublin and also did a PhD at the University of New York. He then went on to distinguished academic careers at Duke University and the University College Dublin, and also finally ended up as chief economist of the Environmental Defence Fund, which I think is out of New York. Which now, interesting, this is one of the former interim climate change committee members, is also I think the chief Frank's successor, who was at Motu and a colleague of Catherine, Susie Kerr. So we have got a shared history as well. But Frank's real interests are tackling environmental issues through the mobilization of markets and enhanced innovation pathways. He has a strong interest in market-based instruments and emissions trading schemes, which also gels with the New Zealand focuses. I'm very interested in the issue of an exporting country like Ireland, how climate change policy is likely to affect things like market access and consumer decisions. And finally, again, to gel with New Zealand interests, he has a strong focus in his current work on how to reduce methane emissions at scale and at a cost that's affordable and acceptable, and how the innovation pathways can be improved to get us to those methodologies for reducing methane emissions at scale. And so I'll hand over to Frank to give us his thoughts around both Ireland and New Zealand and how our two countries have lots in common, and how perhaps if we work together better, we can get faster solutions to the common problems that we have. So over to you, Frank.
Thank you so much, Harry. I'm delighted to be with you. I have a passionate interest in the greenhouse gas management issue generally, but specifically in regard to agriculture. And I see New Zealand as the kind of key leader on this issue around grassland farming in particular. I read the draft advice to the government, all 188 pages. I think it's terrific. And I've only one complaint really, which is a minor one, and that is about innovation, which Harry mentioned, and its mobilization and its potential to drive performance at scale. So in my kind of short introductory remarks, I'll talk first about what's happening out in the world, especially, especially about metrics and tax barriers and so on, because they're very relevant to what could be facing us in Ireland and in New Zealand. I'll talk about the innovation instrument, as Harry flagged, and I'll finish up then with a shameless bit of huckstering for a deep collaboration between Ireland and New Zealand on this issue. First, looking at what's happening out there, the UK is fascinating, and how it's going to use its Brexit freedoms can be very, very powerful in terms of outcomes and in terms of how we position ourselves. The key change that is likely to happen there is that they're going to introduce a pay for performance system, an ecosystem land management process. And once you pay farmers for performance, you get performance. So the key implication for me, if the UK does what it's promising to do, is that we'll see fairly sharp improvements in carbon stewardship and climate in regard to land in the UK over the next 5 or 6 years. The other freedom that the UK has in post-Brexit land is that they can, of course, manage their taxes independently, and especially their trade arrangements. So I think there is a scenario that we in New Zealand and especially in Ireland have to be cognizant of, that the US will become, or the UK rather, will become a serious performer in reducing emissions and increasing its carbon efficiency. That in turn will be followed by an effort to protect their markets against carbon leakage. And essentially for us in Ireland, that's a huge issue because of course it's our main export market. The other development in the UK that I find fascinating is that they've appointed Mark Carney as their finance advisor for COP26. Carney has one big mission which they're going to push in COP26, and that is the development of what he calls a large-scale, high-integrity carbon offset market. And the idea is to measure carbon performance and use that then to attract funds. His estimate is that investment flows will be about 100 billion a year once investors know that the metrics they're being presented with stand up to independent scrutiny. The second big potential player is a surprise, I think, to me and to many, and that is the US. And the US has 3 dimensions that are important. One is the what's called the Food and Agriculture Climate Alliance. And that's the farm organizations essentially, and a couple of environmental NGOs have come up with a strategy for climate. That's revolutionary. It will be bipartisan and is deliberately so. And what could happen as a result of that is federal legislation that provides tremendous tax support benefits and so on for climate action that also, of course, benefits farmers. That's why they're interested in it. And also channels a lot of subsidies and funds in that direction. The reason this is hugely important is that if it happens, and I think there's about a 50% chance that it will, you'll find the US cranking up the innovation machine and becoming a leader in the feedlot intensive indoor feeding farming systems in terms of carbon performance. So the metrics that we've been used to, where we in New Zealand and Ireland stand pretty tall in our kind of carbon efficiency metrics, could be challenged big time. From a climate global policy point of view, that's terrific, because it's wonderful to have that whole swathe of the industry performing much better than before. But of course, it has competitive implications. The second US strand, of course, is California. California has terrific climate ambitions. They haven't got to agriculture yet, but I think they're quite likely to. And what California does today, the rest of the US does tomorrow. And finally, of course, Walmart is an enormous player. And they've said, and they're acting on it, they're going to squeeze 1 billion tons a year out of their supply chain. So the big question for New Zealand and Ireland is, 5 to 10 years from now, will our stuff be on Walmart's shelves or not? So these are big developments in those two jurisdictions. There's also interesting happenings in Europe that I'll come to maybe in the Q&A. The innovation instrument is crucial, I think, because as we can tell from the advice report, and of course we know very well in Ireland, there's a huge challenge in driving methane reduction, enteric methane especially. And without new and better ways to address this challenge, we're going to be floundering, and we won't be able to compete with the new entrants that I've talked about. So I just want to talk on the kind of ingredients of an ecosystem, innovation ecosystem, what it takes to innovate at scale. Look at 2 little case studies. There are 5 features that seem to be consistent. The first is an urgent. When you have an urgent challenge, you get people saying, yes, we have to innovate. You need very smart policies that incentivize innovation at scale. You need entrepreneurial talent. You need research and development. And very importantly, you need markets for the innovation. And small countries can make a difference. The 2 cases I think are worth looking at is, first of all, the Danish wind energy system. Denmark is a tiny country, but they were facing with a huge challenge in the 70s. They were 80% dependent on oil. The OPEC embargo, of course, meant they had a crisis. Urgent challenge, we have to find new sources of energy. And the government put very smart innovation support policies in place. Essentially, they said, the Danish government said, if you come up with an innovation on the energy front that helps meet our needs, we'll pay you handsomely. Direct incentive. They then had a wonderful entrepreneurial force in Peter Hansen and his son Finn. They were complete outsiders, frequently in an innovation ecosystem. The innovation comes from people who are not inside the bubble, but outside it. They knew nothing about energy or windmills, but they took this issue on. The Danes converted the Riso Research Institute, which was a nuclear energy facility, into an renewable energy research. So they had this tremendous research drive. And then in markets, they had a tremendous break in that California in the late 70s had given generous support for renewables. All the American windmills that were put up in the mountains in California blew down. They couldn't stand up. When the Hansen family said, look, we have a windmill, they sold 150 of them to them in California because they stood up. No matter what blew at them, they kept going. So it's a very thumbnail sketch of the kind of key elements to get innovation at scale happening. The second one that I'll be briefer about is the local one here in Ireland, which is Bailey's Irish Cream. The government around the same period in the 70s, actually, the Department of Finance said, look, any company that comes up with innovation in the food area that sells in export markets, any profits from that innovation product will be exempt from tax for 10 years. A very, very simple policy. Money on the table for smart exports. A British company, which had an operation in Ireland, got two people, a South African and an English guy, to look at this. They chewed it over, and the question was, all those lush green rain-sodden pastures and contented cows, how can we convert that into a product? Seymour Davy said, how about mixing Irish whiskey and cream? And the rest is history. They have a research team. They brought in academics. They spent a year getting the product together. They put it out there. And now, of course, it's a hugely, hugely successful innovation and payoff. So the ecosystem is fairly straightforward. And I think it's an important template, because when you look then at our methane problem and what it takes, then that's very, very relevant. Now, when I looked at the New Zealand draft advice, which, as I say, I think is terrific, there's one sentence there that hops out at you. We assume that no new technologies to reduce methane emissions from agriculture are available before 2035, which is 14 years away. And then it kind of works through the genetics, the inhibitors and so on. But essentially that the instrument is parked, and the assumption that it could deliver at scale is by implication also parked. It's a bit odd, of course, because New Zealand, in fact, has quite an impressive research platform. It has the Global Alliance, and it has the research outfit that Harry directs. So my plea, I suppose, is to mainstream innovation as a policy instrument. And Phil Callahan is a huge inspiration in this regard, and I can come back to that. Finally, I want to make a pitch for a deep New Zealand-Ireland partnership. We're on the same journey, and we in Ireland have, enormous admiration for New Zealand. Rugby, for example, Ireland has played New Zealand 35 times and has only won 2 games. So that creates one kind of reflex, but also we like chutzpah. And I've often thought that any country that can convince the Western world to call a Chinese plant kiwi fruit has demonstrated huge powers of persuasion. And I think we like that. But on the specifics, we're on the same journey, politically and technically. We're at the top of the OECD 37 members with export-dominated agriculture, with emissions as a huge share of our total greenhouse gas load. We share the same challenges. We're at the same stage. The building blocks are moving into place. We have shared values and so on. I think most of all, though, I think the chemistry is right. When John Hood came to visit Ireland and kind of look at what we were up to in July in 2019, we had a meeting in Moore Park, the Teagasc Research Centre in Cork. And I was astounded, and I think he was surprised too, at how many Kiwi voices were in the room. So that was one thing. It's already happening up to a point. And the second thing that came across was the enormous passion and enthusiasm of the people in the room. So the core proposition is really, we have the same existential problem. We don't have all the solutions. We can help each other dramatically, I think, and very systematically to address them. And I know Harry will want to, I think, pursue that later. So there's a logic to collaboration. And if you look at it statistically, we both, I think, need to aim to do, quotation marks, too much. Statisticians talk about type 1 error, which is the costs of doing too little and then being confronted with huge costs. And type 2 error, where you do a bit too more but avoid the huge costs. So I think we want to embrace type 2 error, do too much, and foster our economy and our climate. The other final quote I want to finish with is Seamus Heaney, last text which he sent to his wife Marie from hospital the night before he died. It said, "Noli timere, be not afraid." I think that's a good motto to go with. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank, for that quick and fascinating run through of some of your thoughts on the issue. Catherine, do you, based on Frank's talk, do you have an initial question for Frank?
Sure. Thank you so much again, Frank, for your reflections, and you've covered a lot of ground. You commented that we're on similar journeys politically and technically, and I've been looking at Ireland's climate action plan and looking at it in the context of how the EU is moving. And it's fascinating to me to see how different Ireland is from the EU's emission profile as a whole. Now, obviously, the target for Ireland, you make a distinction between ETS sectors and non-ETS sectors. So I'd be interested just to get some thoughts from you on how government policy is shaping up for managing the non-ETS sectors and your target, which I think is a 30% reduction below 2005 emissions by 2030 for non-ETS sectors. But to have agriculture, transport, and forestry grouped together outside of the ETS, how does the government face that challenge of thinking across those sectors?
Well, we have a relatively new government now that's very ambitious climatically. The Greens are partners in it, and the Minister for Climate is a Green. And they are setting a statutory kind of domestic target for 2030 of minus 51%. And that includes trading and non-trading, even though the performance of trading is to some extent out of our control. So the new Climate Commission has just been charged, really. It's doing what you have already done, which is come up with budgets to both meet the 51% by 2030, but also the kind of net zero 2050 ambition, in other words, to get on track for that. The huge elephant in the room is agriculture. It's a big chunk of our total emissions. And if you have a 51% reduction, that's binding legally, then the how of that is enormously challenging. And the strategy at the moment, but it's in evolution, is to really go after nitrous oxide emissions first and get whatever you can in parallel from methane. But the numbers are very, very challenging when you look at that. And that's, again, really why I come back to innovation. When you don't have good choices to reduce at scale, you'd better find them. And you better start finding them now, and you better put the pieces of the innovation ecosystem in place to come out the other end on that front. We have European targets as well, of course, and the European Union has its ambition is minus 55% by 2030. Our focus, by the way, is very much on 2030. I notice 2035 is in a way the most interesting year in your rollout, but 2030 looms very large in our case. The decision has been made on the distribution of that burden, the sharing effort in terms of what each country is going to do is still a work in progress. So I mean, my bottom line is we and New Zealand both have a market interest and a huge kind of compliance, climate responsibility interest to do much better than the current technologies and choices allow us to do on methane.
Can I ask a quick follow-up on that one, Harry? Just briefly, so I was intrigued at the EU's farm to fork strategy to try to reduce emissions in agriculture. And one of the key components there seemed to be eco-labeling for food. And I was interested to know how the Irish agriculture sector has been responding to that and what expectations are for how and when that might be implemented.
Well, first of all, Farm to Fork is a Commission proposal at the moment. As most of your listeners will know, the Commission proposes, but the European Parliament and the member states dispose. They make the decision. So we're a long ways from converting Farm and Fork language into action. However, the message I get from, I've looked pretty heavily now into what's happening in Europe on agriculture, and the Commission is very eager to push ahead on metrics. So there's big commitments now to measure performance in some standard way in terms of emissions. There's a lot of language around carbon farming and certification of carbon farming emissions. And it goes back to my earlier talk about what's happening, in the Mark Carney world. In terms of certifying product, which is in, that also will be part of this agenda. The Commission works slowly on this stuff. So it's a 3 to 5 year project probably before we actually have, that's what it took. It took an awful long time, for example, to come up with certification for what renewables would be acceptable in terms of biomass and the certification for organic farming. In terms of farm response to Farm and Fork, they haven't targeted the labeling issue, interestingly. The focus has been far more on the big reductions in fertilizers that it calls for. On there's a biodiversity parallel strand that's, so there are many other parts of Farm and Fork that are being prioritized. But my own personal view is that the big European contribution will again be on metrics. In the end, they're going to say, and once you have metrics, then policies follow. You get border tax adjustment kind of policies and so on.
Thank you, Harry. I'll pass to you. Thank you so much, Frank.
Thanks, Frank. Frank, just wanted to pick up on your innovation discussion. And often we find that there is a lot of talk that's very optimistic about innovation and collaboration. But to put effect to that across country borders is often not that easy. There are often, each country has their own innovation mechanisms, and to align them across countries is difficult. There are bureaucratic hurdles, etc. How do you see a way out of that impasse? What mechanisms do you feel that could be implemented and put in place to allow two countries with a very shared problem like New Zealand and Ireland to work together in the innovation space to make better progress together than we can do apart? But it's very much around the mechanisms of how we do that, rather than the concept of the idea, which we all agree with, but how do we put it into practice?
Maybe a kind of a side show that's very powerful right in front of us, of course, is the vaccine process. And again, the UK, which flounders in many zones, you know, got this one right. And one of the ways they got it right was to put Kate Bingham in charge of it, who knew what she was doing and could orchestrate things. But essentially, their model was, and I'll get back to the specifics, obviously, of our case, and they said, look, we're going to have a competition to find people who can do innovation at warp speed, to use Trump's term, in this space. They came up with that shortlist. Then they said, we're going to pay you to accelerate the work. One mission, and mission is critical. The mission is vaccine, nothing else. That's the end game. They were totally open to crossing borders. So once you put money on the table and once you have a mission, people tend to respond. And then, of course, they guaranteed purchases and so on. So I think a key to step going forward is to interrogate success as best we can, looking back. In terms of Ireland and New Zealand collaboration and innovation, one area I'm very interested in that we haven't concentrated on much, and neither, I think, have you, is the integration of carbon farming, as they're now calling it in Europe, and production, and what those systems could look like. Susie Kerr has kind of introduced me to South American and Central American experience in this space. So just so that's one kind of mission. How do we integrate carbon farming and meat and milk production effectively? And what does it take? Who are the best people in the world who are doing that? And they're probably not in New Zealand or in Ireland. They're probably in South and Central America. And then kind of work through, get the best minds, the best, if you look at Paul Callahan's talk in 2011, that was about innovation and talent. And his proposition essentially was, if you get the best people around the table with a sense of mission, you get outcomes. Policies, how would we reward innovation? We need to decide that. What mechanisms are we going to put in place? And put the pieces of the ecosystem together on a mission. So methane abatement, of course, is a huge one. So to me, that's a mission that if we said, look, we're going to do this, we're going to find a way to reduce emissions, say by 2030, by 40%, something in that range. Who are the best people in the world who can help us? The best companies in the world? In Europe, we have one, as you know, DSM operating now at scale. Genetics. I was surprised to see in the advice that the success in using genetics to reduce methane emissions from lambs is kind of underway. But then when you look at the projection in the plan, it says 1.5% by 2030 and 3.5% reduction by 2035. So if we said, okay, thought experiment, if we increased our investment on genetics fourfold, where would we allocate our money to increase the prospects of, instead of 1.5% by 2030, it was 5%. In other words, so I think it's a question of mission first, working back to the best talents that could deliver it, then to the policy instruments that would drive it, and then finding somebody to lead it. And in paying particular attention, obviously, to the entrepreneurial community.
Thank you, Frank. I think we now would move on to questions from the floor, basically, and I've got a number that I will try to work my way through. And one of the first ones really does follow up a little bit on that one, Frank. It's at a practical level. There is synergies between New Zealand and Ireland in the sense of we can do work in different seasons so that we can accelerate it. Northern Hemisphere work, Southern Hemisphere work, we can get 2 growing seasons in one. And that there does seem to be a real complementarity from a biological sense. And the question was around what intergovernment levers could be used to support and accelerate this collaboration. So being very specific about that intergovernment levers you feel that can be pulled to help that collaborative effort.
I don't know the answer to that. The Irish experience, I think, is that once our government decides to do something, then they just work backwards to put the pieces in place, reaching out as appropriate, and they find the mechanisms. So I think the order of things should be, this is the agenda that has to be delivered if we're going to deliver at scale. These are the pieces of the jigsaw that would deliver that, and then find the modality. I think the Global Climate Alliance that New Zealand leads, really, I think that's a terrific mechanism, just viewed from the outside, as one institutional that works. And I think a lot of the people that were in the room in Moore Park in July 2019 that I talked about, they were there because of that instrument. So that's a very, very important mechanism. But I think you'd have to say to a deep collaboration that involves strategy. So for example, a strategy on metrics, the measurement issue, strategy on the separation of gases issue. There's a cluster of those. Then how do we, deliver shared outcomes? So I don't worry about the mechanisms. My view in Ireland anyway is that once we know what we want and we're put pieces in place, then we find the mechanisms. But money is key, of course. You have to devote resources.
Yeah, well, that's actually a follow-up question we've had from Catherine, a different Catherine to Catherine who's on the line here, is that you are suggesting that resources are key to this. Where would you suggest those resources are going to come from, and where should they come from?
Well, now in Ireland, we're recycling our carbon revenues, carbon tax revenues, to support the climate agenda. So that's one big pool of support. Whether the European Union, in our kind of local scene in Ireland, if we developed a mission-focused set of ambitions, there are various pools. For example, in Ireland, I don't know if you have considered this, but the European Commission has a green bond model. They're proposing to raise billions with green bonds and then use them to drive the agenda. So in the European context, I would say, look, this is a huge problem for land use in Europe, essentially getting it where it's really performing generally. Ireland and New Zealand can be huge drivers of this. And a green bond mechanism seems to me to be custom made to help fund it. But in the end, it is about priorities. Your Minister for Finance is the most important person in the carbon policy discussion, because in the end, the tax incentives, the kind of incentive framing that New Zealand gives to the agenda that you've come through, and the expenditure that it requires is going to end up on that desk.
Thanks, Frank, for that one. Just something on the gases themselves. As you are well aware, New Zealand has become, I think, the first country to really set separate targets for the different greenhouse gases, and particularly the one that's of interest for agriculture is a separate methane target. So there is a separate methane target in New Zealand for biological methane emissions, and that's controversial to some. To some, it's to get out. It's seen as a way of agriculture avoiding a harsh target. For others, it's very much in line with the science and certainly with the IPCC recommendations about what is needed to stay within 1.5 degrees. But the potential side effect of that, with respect to your innovation, is does it actually reduce the urgency to tackle the methane issue when the target is reduced? It's no longer a net zero target. It becomes less than that, maybe on good scientific grounds. But do you feel that that reduces the urgency of the innovation pathway for methane?
No. I think on the split gases leadership, I mean, I think you're right. The IPCC report puts cards on the table and says, look, we need to treat this gas separately. The short-lived gases are different, basically, and need to be treated differently. But at the same time, the science is telling us emphatically that reducing methane emissions helps a lot. I like to quote your former science advisor, Gluckman, on that subject. I think he's very, very perceptive that every ton of methane you put up there is a cost and a near term, and it has many negatives. So the urgency to reduce a lot is still there and will always be there. The good news is, though, that it does not have to be zero. And I do applaud New Zealand for putting this on the agenda and for essentially adopting it. In Ireland, we're not free to do that because the European Union, of course, hasn't made that decision and is not examining it or addressing it in any kind of substantive way. So all of our legally binding European obligations are applied the old kind of equivalency, and there's no split gas kind of thinking. So I was a bit alarmed actually when I think I got a clip from Lord Debon, and he was kind of saying what you're saying, Harry, that New Zealand is kind of skiving off here on its because of this split gas thing, that agriculture is the biggest industry and it looks like they're trying to get away with stuff. So there is a big communications issue there. So we need to do, there's nothing in the IPCC report that tells you you should do less on methane. It says you should keep working at it, hammer and tongs, but you don't have to reduce it. No, that's the core message. So that'll be unfortunate if farmers absorb the idea that we don't have to worry about methane because it's, anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. So I certainly am not suggesting that I disagree with the split gas target. I think the science is clear on that. Just to change things, a focus on a very different aspect. In many ways, is our outlook for the next 30 years predicated on a business as usual model where we've got an ongoing market for animal protein, and we are trying to produce animal protein with less emissions. But should we, what's your view on things like other sources of protein where we might see a technical revolution, where they can be things like artificial meat, they may be artificial milks, a fermentation process. We don't necessarily need animals to get those products, and there could be dietary shifts away from animal protein and energy sources to vegetable sources. So, and how do you see that one playing out? And then how do you see both our economies being actually very vulnerable to those big technological shifts if they occur?
Yes, well, I think especially the kind of meat substitute movement is fascinating. And again, it's an example of innovation. If you look at Impossible Foods, for example, the founder of that company, Stanford Brown, his ambition is essentially to destroy the meat industry on ecological grounds. That's his logic. And the whole innovation system that he's driving and putting in place has that ambition. So again, going back to the innovation space, you have a mission, and everything they're doing is to deliver on their mission. What will happen in terms of breakthroughs, we just don't know. There's vast noise in that space, but on the meat side, it's still less than 1% of the total consumption. But for Ireland and New Zealand, I think it heightens the argument. And it heightens it pretty dramatically. I think in a risk management way, we should say, okay, this could happen big time. It could take a chunk of the market, both in milk substitutes, animal substitutes and meat. We have to improve our performance dramatically, because in the kind of metrics of the marketplace, we want to say, look, we have many, many positive features to what we're about, and our climate performance is exemplary. So that's what we should be aiming for anyway. But there's a very strong market reason to do it, because other animal suppliers could outdo us, but also there's the animal substitute movement that will be chewing away at markets. So I think from a risk management point of view, all of this points me to saying that both Ireland and New Zealand should innovate as they're innovating to reduce our carbon footprint.
Can I just add a follow-up to that, and whether this is something that's been thought about? Although it may be possible to reduce emissions from agriculture, there's another strand of the argument that says basically animal agriculture takes up a lot of land, and that land could be spared for things like the production of biofuels, the carbon offsets, etc. So even if you can reduce emissions from animals, there is an argument they take up a lot of land, and that by taking up that land, they are reducing mitigation opportunities from other sources. Is that something that's been discussed at all in Ireland?
It's not, I think, to be fair. I suppose in the experience with alternative uses of farmland that's now used for animals in the kind of bioenergy space has been poor, become a phenomenon. But the language in Europe is very interesting now. The language of carbon farming, certifying carbon performance. If you push that to its logical conclusion, then you could see a future where a lot of farmers decide to become carbon farmers and get out of livestock. Or you could see a future, which I think is the more likely one, where you get an evolution of integrated carbon farming and livestock farming packages and so on. So I think we need to be open to those changes. And as we approach the net zero challenge, the whole carbon capture side of things is going to loom large. I think in Europe, it's the 2050 discussion that has triggered a new interest in farming and in land, because people say net zero means we have to capture a lot of carbon. Where are we going to do that? Well, one obvious option is on land. And then, of course, you're into trade-offs between land uses. So I think it's a fascinating evolution, but I think it will be an evolution. And farmers will respond to incentives. If the European system decides we're going to really incentivize carbon farming, that's what's going to happen.
Thank you. Just a question from Andreas Wilkes. So this is really about avoiding shifting emissions to different jurisdictions. As both New Zealand and Ireland have companies with significant international operations. How can we avoid shifting emissions if national policies are put in place? So is it a little bit like squeezing a plastic bag full of water? You push it down here, but it may come up somewhere else. How can we, in implementing national policies, avoid that happening?
I think I think the drift of language as opposed to action at the moment is to protect against, I mean, carbon leakage is the kind of jargon term for what she's talking about. And actually it's rhetoric you hear a lot in New Zealand and in Ireland, is that if we cut back, our farming efforts, the food will be produced anyway, but in jurisdictions that are much less efficient, and therefore emissions will grow rather than decline. So I think what's happening in the world is the metrics issue is becoming central, and this is what Mark Harney is pushing. The trade issue is beginning to loom, and the idea of using some kind of taxes or other mechanisms to avoid leakage is beginning to loom. So I think it's really important to be sensitive to and aware of the carbon leakage issue. I think it is really important. And we're beginning to see mechanisms that are appearing that will address it. And Europe, I think, again, is a place to watch in that space, because they've put the carbon tax adjustment issue on the table. And once something is on the table, sometimes it begins to actually be implemented. But strategically for Ireland and New Zealand, the way for us to fight that issue is to improve our performance. If we improve our performance, then we'll thrive, and if we don't, we won't.
Yeah, thank you, Frank. One strand of argument goes that although we may argue that it's very hard to reduce emissions from the livestock sector, another argument is it's actually very easy. You just simply reduce the number of livestock. And I got a question from Jeremy Emmett Booth, which is, could you comment on the likelihood of a herd reduction in Ireland to meet your climate targets? And is it necessary, feasible, or appropriate? And I think the same question could be asked of New Zealand.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I was intrigued in the advice, the draft advice, to see that the assumption is that livestock numbers under business as usual, I think, will fall between 5 and 10%. And with the policies, and I presume it's the trading, I mean, Catherine would know better than me. I presume it's the trade price that the assumption in terms of the budgets is that the stock numbers will fall by 15%. So I think, I mean, maybe I'm misinterpreting my reading of the data, but that seems to be key. So the market will drive some change, and then policy will drive other change. My personal preference is to put the policies in place that give parity of esteem to climate. you know, and that all the signals that people get tell them climate now matters. And allow the stock then to adjust to whatever reduces emissions at scale, rather than saying reduction of livestock per se is the kind of instrument of choice. So that debate is quite lively in Ireland at the moment. I think the trading scheme you have is ideal in terms of navigating that territory, that if you have a trading scheme with good price signals, you'll get what you need in terms of reductions in emissions, and livestock numbers will adjust accordingly. I think it's kind of inefficient to do livestock as a separate instrument, so to speak. But it's a big issue, and you know, where it lands in Ireland and in New Zealand, I think, is still an open question.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you for very frank answers to the questions. Unfortunately, we're about run out of time. It's now 7:55, and I'd like to hand back to Charlie for a thank you and a roundup. But thanks very much, Frank, for that. It was a very fascinating discussion.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to everyone who's joined us today. It's been really great to hear your questions, and we hope that you've learned a lot. I just want to say a big thank you to Frank, to echo what Harry said, for taking the time to share your expertise and wisdom with us in Aotearoa. And thank you to those of you that have joined both here and across the globe. And thank you to Harry and Catherine for facilitating such an interesting discussion and Q&A. We hope that you all enjoy the rest of your evening or your day, depending on whereabouts you are. So I'm just going to hand over to Phil now, who's going to close the session for us with a karakia. But thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Frank. I really enjoyed that. Bevan got called away, so he's asked me to just close off with a karakia. So, kia tau, kia tātou katoa, te atawhai o tō tātou ariki ai hukaraite, me te aroha o te atua, me te whiwhinga tahitanga, ki te wairua tapu ake amine. And again in English, that is, may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all forevermore. Amine. Ka kite. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you.